Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. Today we are in lecture 9 in the last module, and our lecture today is entitled Critiquing Cultural Studies. As always, let us do a recap of what we did in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we talked about cultural policy, and one of the first points that we dwelt upon was the distinction between two types of intellectuals, as was given to us by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. According to Gramsci, we saw that intellectuals may be divided into two types: the traditional intellectuals and the organic intellectuals. Further, we went on to define cultural policy as the regulation, management and administration of all cultural products, artifacts and practices. And we found that there were certain institutions that produced and governed the form and content of cultural products. So, which meant that even if we practiced culture, even if we held certain cultural forms and artifacts and products as holding value, things that need to be put forward into the public arena, public sphere, we found that there was always an element, and many would say a necessary element, of control of the production and distribution of cultural goods and forms. So, we then found that these bodies are common to all cultures, to all nations, and these sort of these sort of bodies that control the production and distribution of cultural forms may be art and culture councils, museums, government departments that dealt with culture, educational institutions, media industries and corporations and advertising agencies. Then we found that Barker, in his book Cultural Studies, associates these bodies and councils and different agencies, so to speak, with power, and says that these are the agencies that have the power to name, the power to create official versions, right, to deem something as commonsensical and others as almost ridiculous, and finally, they have the power to legitimize. They have the power to legitimize all cultural products and forms that were to be channelized and given to the public, right. So, the call therefore, we saw to academicians was this, that academicians should not remain at the level of discourse, at the level of abstractions, but also should plunge themselves into policy making, into helping these various wings of government or other councils, even NGOs, in a bid to sort of regulate, also take part in the regulation of what may be considered official, what may be considered legitimate, and what may be considered culturally sensitive and apt and all encompassing. So, we also found that pragmatism as a philosophy, as a school of thought in cultural studies, is most suited as far as cultural policy is concerned, or if not most suited, is one of the philosophical schools or orientations in cultural studies that have been pointed to by many scholars as one of the better ways of engaging with cultural studies. And we found one name, that was that of Richard Rorty, and we saw that pragmatism as a school is useful as as a sort of guiding spirit of cultural policy, in that it is by nature anti-representational, anti-foundationalist and anti-realist, and just because they are so, it does not mean that they cannot contribute to social reform. They contribute to social reform by understanding the anti-foundationalism and the provisionality of all knowledge. Okay. So, this was a recap of the last lecture on cultural policy. Fine. So, today the topic of discussion in our class is a critique of cultural studies, and I would like you to pay close attention to some of the points that are going to be made here, because if we are honest scholars, okay, if we, and particularly in cultural studies I should say, if we believe that our work should get better, if we believe that we should not hide or push anything under the carpet, if we believe in intellectual honesty and integrity, and also by the very nature of cultural studies that it itself is a critiquing enterprise, largely a critiquing enterprise, both from the point of view of its semiological approach and its political economy approach, we should also put cultural studies to the test, okay, to the critical test. Now, we know that cultural studies is known as a belligerent discipline. It is known as we saw in one of the lectures, an insurgent sociology. Okay. It is known to put everything, every cultural form into test, or to to a test. Now, therefore, it is only logical for us, okay, to understand and accept the fact that, well, even cultural studies itself should be critiqued, right, if cultural studies is to be honest to itself. Now, when we talk about critique, really it is quite a loaded term. Critique does not mean simply criticism, right. If it meant only criticism, then we do not need a word like critique. As you know, really there is nothing called pure synonymy in language. If there is a second word, it means that the next word has a shade of meaning that is different from the previous word. Anyhow, critique may therefore be understood as of course, the criticism, there is always an element of being being suspicious, being being a little sort of querying about an area, and at the same time critique also means to lay bare the presumptions, or to lay bare the the central axioms, and to put to scrutiny, right, the central axioms and central beliefs and premises, the postulates of any area of study. Okay. So, as we understood, critique then has both the element of querying and the element querying almost so that you can sort of point to the negative aspects of a domain, and at the same time sort of uncovering, right, the premises and axioms of any domain, right. So, this is what we are also going to do today in our lecture, and what I have done is I have tried to bring some of the very sharp, also some of the very sharp criticisms of cultural studies. It's on its methodology, on its the criticism of its of many of its aspects that do not seem to be quite right with some critics, right. So, anyway, let us see what this critique of cultural studies, in the sense of both uncovering its postulates and a criticism in the sense of querying very sharply some of its central tenets are concerned. Okay. Well, let us now look at the key source texts that we shall be taking the help of as we talk about the critique of cultural studies, and some of these are Chris Barker's The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Tony Bennett and John Frau's edited volume, The Sage Handbook of Cultural Analysis, Cary Nelson and Dilip P. Gaonkar's edited volume, Disciplinarity and Dissent in Cultural Studies. You are acquainted with many of these books. I think perhaps you are not, this is the first time we are bringing in Frederick Jameson's book and this volume entitled Disciplinarity and Dissent in Cultural Studies. Well, let us now look at a quotation from the literary critic and poet T.S. Eliot, and we are looking at a brief passage from Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. Now, you may be wondering why we are bringing in a literary person's work here, okay, when we are talking about cultural studies and theory. This is it's not the first time that that one is talking about this. Critics have pointed out to this extract in a bid really to show how culture, the study of culture, okay, may in many eyes sort of they look at it, and this is a very loaded term, the degeneration, okay, of cultural studies into the trivial, into the ordinary. Though many would say that the ordinary and the everyday are certainly not trivial, because cumulatively they give rise to our cultural practices, right. But first let us read what Eliot says, and we shall see why this gives us, you know, the some sort of a feeling of something trivial going on here, because it is a critique or criticism of cultural studies. Now, Eliot says in his essay, culture includes all the characteristic activities and interests of a people. Now, here is he is talking about English culture, and the way it is presented here, right, it has been sort of caught upon by cultural critics, okay, particularly those critics of cultural studies who see it as a domain that is increasingly trivializing its subject matter, right. So, culture includes all the characteristic activities and interests of a people: Derby Day, Henley Regatta, cows, the 12th of August, a cup final, the pin table, the dartboard, Wensleydale cheese, boiled cabbage cut into sections, beetroot in vinegar, 19th century Gothic churches, and the music of Elgar. In its very, sort of inventory of different aspects of British culture, okay, ranging from boiled cabbage to 19th century Gothic churches, okay, Eliot may not have really meant it quite tongue in cheek or as a sarcastic comment on British culture, right. He may or may not have done it, but what I said just a while ago is this has been sort of seized upon by a critic or two to show that cultural studies as a domain, in its insistence on everyday practices and the so-called micro areas of life, has as a domain sort of trivialized itself. So, we will in this lecture then go on and look at some of the other kinds of criticisms that have been levied on cultural studies. Okay. Now, we will look at an essay by Arjun Appadurai entitled Diversity and Disciplinarity as Cultural Artifacts. Here in this essay, generally speaking, Appadurai is not really offering a sharp criticism of cultural studies. In fact, he talks about the university and the discipline cultural studies and the diversity therein from a much more sophisticated vantage point. But these topics, these characteristics of cultural studies that have been given by him are not exactly his critique. What he is doing here in this essay is telling us what the way people have looked at cultural studies and the way they have sort of assessed cultural studies, right, in a negative way. Some of the phrases and terms that have been used in Appadurai's essay are these. For instance, he says many have found, please look at this slide, he says many have sort of deemed cultural studies an overdetermined landscape of anxieties. Okay. Then he says many have found the theoretical assumptions of cultural studies and also the theoretical practices of cultural studies to be largely derived from French theory, especially French post-structuralism, right. Then the topics were again too popular, right. Appadurai says that many critics have found the topics to be too popular, if not populist. The style is again deemed to be too glitzy for academic standards, and where many have felt perhaps that the style sort of lowers academic standards. Then they have that the fact the jargon is very hybrid, right. The terminology, we remember we talked about the use of terminology and discursive writing in cultural studies. We had said that cultural studies being an arena which is largely a redescription of things. If you remember the first lecture, which is a redescription of things in a bid to defamiliarize the already and always familiar. But many have found the jargon to be too hybrid, which ultimately results in too many things perhaps being said about any topic. The politics of cultural studies is seen to be many by largely post-colonial in nature, and finally, the multiculturalism that is advocated by many scholars of cultural studies is seen to be something that is rather excessive in nature, which he calls hyper multiculturalism. Okay. So, what are some of the the criticisms and the negative comments on cultural studies that we have found through Arjun Appadurai's his collection of these terms that have been given to us by many critics, and these are that the theory is the main points here are that the theory is too dependent on French structuralism and post-structuralism in particular, and that the jargon used is so hybrid that we do not it's difficult to contain it, cultural studies, as a domain with a clear cut terminology, and that the multiculturalism is too expansive, too hyper, too excessive. So, we would then have to, even as we look at these, we would then have to either defend cultural studies, okay, from such almost accusations, and we have to sort of revisit cultural studies, right, and to see that is it really a fact that the style is too glitzy, or that the jargon is too varied and too hybrid for us to ultimately make sense of it, okay, and there is too much linguistic gymnastics, if you will. Okay, so these are the things which you and I can look at in a positive light. Why in a positive light? So that we can correct, okay, some of these faults, if at all these faults are there. Therefore, cultural studies is seen by many as trendy, right, almost fashionable academically, not truly scholarly, where no real research is done, and because of the fact that it is it is a discipline that is so heterogeneous. And remember, in the first lecture we saw that it was called not only interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary and enterprise, it was also post-disciplinary. So, by nature cultural studies does not believe in being within the confines or limits and limitations of any discourse or any one discipline. It says that if you have to critique culture, if you have to critique the use of power and the abuse of power, okay, through discourse, through representation, then you of necessity would have to sort of break the disciplinary boundaries, okay, because the attack has to be from so many sides. The attack has to be from political economy, from race studies, from feminism, okay, from sexuality, from all these. So, you have to sort of take the help of several disciplines, and therefore, you do not by that logic have any set jargon of your own, and that is why it is bound to be a bit hybrid. So, these are some of the comments that have been made by people, and we shall see who are those scholars who have who feel that these cultural studies has suffered from such such bias, or such, you could say, as they say, lack of real depth as far as research is concerned. Okay. Now, if we look, or if we zoom in to some of the kindred domains, or if we look at those domains or disciplines that have, from where the voices of criticism, right, against cultural studies are found, one is quite surprised to find that these are domains that are very close to cultural studies. Okay. These are domains and disciplines that are kindred disciplines, as we saw in our first lecture. Okay. These disciplines are kindred disciplines as far as cultural studies is concerned, and some of these, at least the main ones, are anthropology, sociology, literary theory, and political economy, particularly Marxism. Okay. These domains perhaps have felt that many of their subject matters, many of their themes, many of their data sort of have been appropriated by cultural studies. Many would feel that many of their methodologies have been radically queried, right, by cultural studies. For instance, in our lecture on science, technology and cultural studies, we found that one of the reasons why cultural studies, epistemologically speaking at least, emerged was that it came about as, recall the phrase, insurgent sociology. Okay, that it was a sociology that took issue with many of the existent methodologies, and particularly we saw took issue with the positivist school of thought. Okay. Literary theory, as we shall see in a while, is also a field which is, many would even say that literary theory is cultural theory, or that cultural theory is literary theory. They are so enmeshed together that many would find it difficult to call it either a cultural theory or a literary theory. Okay. And also because theory in literature, what many call the post-structuralist turn, or the linguistic turn in literary studies, was deeply influenced obviously by post-structuralism, right. And the political economy, the Marxists have another point to make about cultural studies, which we will be seeing or looking at just in a while. So, what are the the four main domains, or the chief domains that have, from where we find the voices of criticism are quite frequently coming from? These are, as we have seen, anthropology, sociology, literary theory, okay, and Marxism. Now, this sort of unease of other disciplines, right, with cultural studies is articulated so beautifully by Stuart Hall, okay, in one of his essays. Then the essay is entitled "The Emergence of Cultural Studies and the Crisis of the Humanities," and I shall read from Hall's essay, and we shall see how this critique began to come in very quite early on, really. Okay. Now, let's look at what Hall has to say. On the day of the Center for Cultural Studies at Birmingham University's opening, and you recall that we talked about the importance of the Center for Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, okay, where really cultural studies as a discipline was established, right. So, he says that on the day of the center's opening, we received letters from the English department saying that they couldn't really welcome us. They knew we were there, but they hoped we would keep out, look at this, hoped we would keep out of their way while they got on with the work they had to do. We received another rather sharper letter from the sociologists saying, in effect, we hope you don't think you are doing sociology, because that's not what you are doing at all. Okay? A very poignant input, I should feel. And let's read this very quickly once again. This is Stuart Hall talking about, a time when even on the day of the opening of the Center for Cultural Studies, was marked by sort of dissent from other disciplines. On the day of the Center for Cultural Studies at Birmingham University's opening, we received letters from the English department saying that they couldn't really welcome us. They knew we were there, but they hoped we would keep out of their way while they got on with the work they had to do. We received another rather sharper letter from the sociologists saying, in effect, we hope you don't think you are doing sociology, because that's not what you are doing at all. Now, the surprising thing is, since the day the day of the opening of the center, and till today as we discuss these things, these kind of dissenting voices, these kind of complaints, so to speak, from other disciplines, continue to pour in, right. The critique, or rather the criticism from the literature stream, from the domain of literature, is articulated again by Cary Nelson in the essay entitled Literature as Cultural Studies. And I am quoting from Nelson. Let us see what Nelson has to say about the complaint from literature. For literary studies, cultural studies means giving up the hierarchizing cultural memory. This is a very important word, cultural memory that has dominated the field throughout the century. The search for masterworks has to be replaced with an effort to understand literary texts as part of wider discursive formations. So, another reason for at least established and if I may use the word traditionalist scholars from literature, it's there was a kind of literary studies which has had a very long and strong history, the valorization of some works as canonical works, and this word here, cultural memory, right. So, one has a memory of one's cultural products, one's cultural history. One also has, the moment you say English literature, who comes to your mind? You have immediately talk about Chaucer, you talk about William Shakespeare, and you talk about William Wordsworth, etc. Right? So, these are the writers who have been canonized, and they form a very powerful part of the cultural memory of literary scholars. So, now what happens is these literary scholars are being asked to look very sharply at their own cultural memory, at least a cultural memory of the discipline. They have been asked to the point has been made here, the search for masterworks has to be now replaced with what? Replaced with very very sharp, I said, a very sharp revision of what counts as literature. There are many literary critics who today say that literary critics who have very strong connections or who are totally in favor of a cultural studies discourse or methodology. They have also said that what is literature is something to be deeply queried. Perhaps they say that everything is a work of art, everything is and again from the point of view of post-structuralist theory, everything is a text, and every text, whether it is a newspaper article or whether it is a play by Shakespeare like Hamlet, for instance, both are texts and both have signifying practices, both are encoded, both are discursive formations, and more than holding up a few pieces of work as high art or high literature and talking about them incessantly is perhaps not they feel not a very good thing to do when there is so much of inequality built into discursive formations, into representations. There is so much of ideology in the whole enterprise of masterworks and of cultural memory. Right. So, obviously, we would find one section of literary scholars going through a lot of unease as cultural studies comes in and sort of, if I may use the word, sort of upsets, right, the whole apple cart of at least traditionalist literary studies. Okay. So, what happens, I would say, is that this, to be fair to cultural studies and to definitely to defend cultural studies, one would say that it is hard work, right. It is hard work not only from the point of view of, of doing hard academic work in the sense that looking at so many domains, etc. It is hard work also to sort of try to begin to remove what we may call the habits of mind, the patterns of mind. Okay? All these things like cultural memory, masterworks, etc. are part of, you would say, the habits of mind, okay, that try and have sort of sort of become used to talking about things in certain ways, okay, till a time when it becomes, you are not even looking at the very discourse that you are using. Okay. So, a certain self-reflexiveness or self-reflexivity perhaps is not welcome by many, because it is hard work in a different sense. Okay. It means, as I said, okay, even critiquing yourself, your own assumptions, your own cultural biases, for instance. Okay. If you are a very well established professor, for instance, you may not want at the height of your career to really disown some of the earlier work that you have done, which may seem to have a lot of problems as far as issues of power and issues of politics are concerned. Okay. So, as I said, it is not again only limited to literature. Really, all disciplines then have had to face the fact that cultural studies was sort of asking all these disciplines, including, as we saw, sciences, science and technology, to rethink and to begin to redescribe, and to be reflexive of some of their established ways of thinking. And that is why I would feel, as somebody who has also allowed herself, okay, to be queried by cultural studies, it is, I have found that many may not find it very conducive, okay, to established ways of thinking. Okay. So far what we have seen is the sort of the complaints, okay, that have come from other disciplines, and we also looked at some of the labels, so to speak, some of the comments that have been made on cultural studies as being, for instance, too trendy or too glitzy, etc., etc. Okay. So, we are now going to look at another a sharp criticism and critique of cultural studies, in the sense that the textuality, remember cultural studies, again as we saw in the first or second lecture, cultural studies sees every cultural artifact as a text. Okay. For instance, this very lecture that this very lecture that is going on now, this very video lecture that is going on, this virtual class that is going on, is then a text for any cultural studies. In fact, after I complete this, I may go back and watch this and analyze this as a text and try to tell you what's actually going on in this lecture, what are the things that I am foregrounding, what are the things that I am hiding, for instance. Okay. So, when everything is a text, then many feel that we may fall prey to a certain textualism, where the text becomes an ism, so to speak, to see everything as everything as a system of codes, in being sorry, the elements or units in a text as being only as having meaning only, as we saw in structuralism, in relation to other units, okay, in contrast to other units in a text. All that is absolutely fine, as we know that it's part and parcel, and it's one of the very important aspects of cultural studies. Now, what some have felt is this word, that textualism itself may become ultimately an ideology. Okay. Remember now, what is ideology? As we found in the lectures on ideology in the second module, ideology may be defined as a way of looking at things. Okay. Ideology is defined as a worldview, right, what we may call a set of lenses by which you look at the world, understand the world, judge the world, and also on which your the ideas on which your actions and decisions are based, right. So, when textualism becomes an ideology, then what happens is what we look at this through the words of Frederick Jameson on his book on postmodernism. He says that textuality then becomes the intellectual expression of the cultural logic of late capitalism. Okay. He ties it, or he relates it to capitalism or high capitalism, or the latest stage of capitalism, in saying that the purely textual way of looking at or of analyzing anything, be it literature or be it any data in sociology or in the sciences, okay, is ultimately only aids late capitalism or aids the capitalist ethos. Okay. Why? The capitalist ethos does not encourage, okay, the critique of its mode of production, right. Now, what happens is, if one gets too textual and one gets too semiological, talking only about meaning production, that is fine, talking about meaning production is fine, but if and when it is at the the expense of showing how those meaning production processes come about in the first place, okay, because of a certain mode of production. Remember the base and the superstructure, because of a certain arrangement in the economic base, because of certain relations of production that exist that are unequal, right, that lead to inequality, sorry, that are not equal, that do not treat everyone as equal. Okay. In that sense, what happens is, if you continue to do only textual criticism, again as I said, which is not backed up. Okay. If you have textual criticism, semiological criticism, talking about signifying practices and codes, which is again explained, okay, explained further by a political economy approach, then that is the best way of doing cultural studies. But if one harps on textuality all the time, or if you write an essay where there is even a beautiful textual analysis, but there is no sort of framework on which to put it, or there is no showing the whole process of power and politics and inequality that inheres, okay, in the very text itself, and also inheres in how you decode the text, how meanings are produced and how you decode the text, then of course one has a right to say that this kind of criticism becomes only sort of you will say a self-indulgent kind of criticism. It becomes a matter of language games, as we saw again in the first two lectures in the series of video lectures. Okay. So, many have taken this criticism very seriously, and as I had said again, the mixing of methodology, the textual methodology, and in this and the political economy approach is one of the most holistic approach you can have to cultural analysis. So, then again, as I said, I would bring in several critics here and the way they have critiqued cultural studies, and the next is from a book entitled Millennial Dreams. Millennial Dreams is by Paul Smith, and we are now going to read from Millennial just one or two sentences from Millennial Dreams in order to see how Paul Smith has articulated his critique. Now, Paul Smith says, in the division of the economic, the civic and the cultural realms, cultural studies fails to grasp that the only object it can with validity propose as its own is the totality of social relations and cultural productions at given times and in given places. Okay? Let us read this again. Cultural studies, right, in dividing the economic and or in separating the economic, the civic and the cultural realms, when it does it at all. Okay? And of course, perhaps there have been many instances, otherwise this kind of critique would have not come about. Now, what happens is, in the separation, again as I said a while earlier, of the textual and the economic, then the civic and the cultural realms, when these are separated, then Smith says cultural studies fails to grasp one thing, that any enterprise it may undertake, which is worth its while, which would even have tremendous contribution to the understanding of culture and of power and politics in our society, okay, is as it says, the totality of social relations and cultural productions at given times and given places. Okay. So, he says, look at the word here, I think this word is what we have been talking about just a while ago, the totality of social relations. You cannot break up cultural studies if you have to, if you aim to make very important or aim to have very important findings, okay, of how culture works. If you aim to give real solid, propositions on trying to explain why we live the kind of lives that we live, which I said in lecture 1 was one of the first questions that we must ask ourselves, and one of the first questions, one of the things that cultural studies tries to explain to us, why do we live the kind of lives that we live. Then if we do not, do not make it a holistic enterprise, and if you kind of cut it open too fine into too many segments, then we lose the impact of our work. Okay. So, I feel that all these, again let me reiterate, all these criticisms are very valuable criticism, right. If we find that cultural studies has been guilty of all these, and definitely it has to be corrected. Then he goes on, Paul Smith in Millennial Dreams, indeed without this kind of recognition, cultural studies must be condemned. Look at this word, condemned as exactly one more bourgeois form of knowledge production. Okay. So, if cultural studies very unfortunately becomes, in the end just another, another reiteration of the capitalist ethos, okay, it becomes the sort of tool of the bourgeois class, as I mentioned here, or tool, if it becomes a tool really of one class oppressing another, then it is one would say a tragedy that would happen, right. So, without the recognition of cultural studies as a discipline, that its aim would have to be the totality of the social, the relations among ourselves, okay, the social relations, the relation between a person who is working in the field and the person who is in the industry, the relation between one who is teaching and one who is being taught. These are potentially at least lopsided relationships, where the power obviously is in the hands of the one and not in the hands at all of the other. In that case, what happens is cultural studies is in the service, okay, of the capitalist ethos. As remember, if you go back to our lectures, Adorno and Horkheimer had shown in their work on the culture industry. Okay. So, one has to be immensely careful as it reflects, let me read on, as it reflects the divisions between the realms that it is the desperate effort of capitalist discourse to police. Okay. So, it becomes part and parcel of capitalist discourse. Too much textualism, okay, only takes us away from very very unequal conditions, okay, of life, of social relations, and that is something which is counterproductive to one of the aims of cultural studies. And if you remember, one of the aims of cultural studies is that we do not only analyze, okay, we make a difference. Okay, we use our analysis to make a difference and to work towards a better world. In that case, if we continue, as Paul Smith has said, if we continue to to segment the different areas of cultural studies, then again it becomes too hybrid an area which ultimately is ineffectual. Okay. Then I would like to bring to you another quotation from Stuart Hall, and this time this is from the essay Signification, Representation, Ideology, right. Hall too, obviously being one of the most important practitioners of cultural studies, one of the most important theoreticians of cultural studies, who has really in a sense taken it upon himself, okay, in so many of his essays to answer or to talk back, to respond would be a more correct word, to respond to these various very as far as academics goes, really serious allegations being made against cultural studies. Hall says here, social relations do exist, we are born into them. He says there is no denying the fact, okay, we are born into social relations, right. They exist independently of our will. They are real in their structure and tendency. Social relations exist independent of mind, independent of thought. He says, well, there is no denying the fact that we are born into social relationships. Social relationships are part and parcel of our cultural life. Okay, as Marx said, remember, we enter into relations of production. Go back to the lecture on Marxism. Man enters, as Marx said, enters into relations of production that are independent of their will, right. So, here also Hall says social relations exist independently of our will. We are real in their structure and tendency. They are real in their structure and tendency. Social relations exist independent of mind, independent of thought. Then he says, okay, he says, and yet, this is immensely important, and yet they can only be conceptualized in thought in the head. Now, we may say, this is I would say a beautiful a beautiful way in which Hall is trying to defend cultural studies. He says, well, when you begin to talk about this in the first place, right, we begin to talk about these social relations, we begin to talk about all this happens in our minds, okay, we are creating them, right, and in the process of creating them, we are giving rise to certain concepts, we are taking the help of certain tools, okay, and these can be conceptualized only in the process of thought, and these can be articulated and presented to the people in the form of language or in the form of other media which talk about social relations, which critique unequal social relations, right. So, if it is said that cultural studies is too discursive, in that sense it cannot, there is nothing called too discursive, because discourse is a part of cultural studies, okay. Cultural studies accepts the fact, okay, and at the same time, in order, as we have seen, in order to sort of balance out this, in order to see that does not become too textual, cultural policy has come in very strongly, where academicians are sort of encouraged and even exhorted by cultural studies to contribute to the formulations of cultural policy. Second, again, as I said, this very anti-positivist nature of cultural studies, where it tries to bring to our to our understanding, okay, the fact that knowledge is provisional. Now, this is not simply a domain of cultural studies. In philosophy too, in epistemology and in some of the other areas, we find that there has always been, since Greek times, since Greek philosophy, there has always been an acceptance of the fact that knowledge is provisional, but knowledge works, right. So, in being, as I please look at this slide, in being anti-positivist and in talking quite frequently about uncertainty, about provisionality, about discourse and indeterminacy and over-determination. Okay. Some of the very important foundational work done by cultural studies will always talk about these areas. Now, this is what brings in unease to people. All this while we have been said that whatever we have been taught, whatever sort of the important people in certain fields have traditionally taught us, that these are these are products of knowledge which will always stand the test of time, etc. No, cultural studies, and because cultural studies talks about over determination, that phenomena, including cultural phenomena, are determined by causes more than we can even think about, okay, and the indeterminacy, right, indeterminacy and the provisionality of all knowledge forms. This is something that is hard to swallow by many people, and hence some of the critiques, to be fair to cultural studies, some of the critiques and the critical voices from other fields and other areas, particularly positivist areas, therefore are bound to come in. But as scholars of cultural studies, we have to also stand our ground, Okay. And to say that it is cultural studies is not just a trendy subject. Okay. When it is fortified, when it is fortified by a will to change the world, when it is fortified by domains that methodologies that look very sharply and critically at existing unequal relationships in society, then cultural studies cannot be just a fashionable or trendy enterprise. Okay. It is quite baggy, it is very it encompasses a lot, and therein, and that is the quality of cultural studies which should be harnessed by everyone. Okay. Therefore, to end this lecture on the critique of cultural studies, and now we could say even the critique of cultural studies, we find, as Barker has shown us, that there is therefore a triangular, we may end by saying that there is a triangular confrontation, as he calls it, okay, because there is a legacy of Marxism with cultural studies, okay, and when you move away from that legacy, many are sort of alarmed that things are getting too textual. Then there is the development of an anti-reductionist strain within cultural studies, and there is of course the ascendancy of post-structuralism. So, that is why this confrontation is from three things coming together. One is as Barker says, one is a history of studying culture, okay, from a purely materialist and very heavily political economy based way of looking at cultural studies, and with the coming in of post-structuralism and the anti-reductionist, say the anti-positivist strain, what happens is the hitherto the already established way of looking at culture is sort of alarmed at these new developments. But in the end, I would say my belief is that the judicious mixture, you cannot deny, if you look very carefully at some of the important formulations of post-structuralism, you cannot deny the way or deny the importance of the way post-structuralism has queried knowledge forms, right. But if it is sort of buttressed, or if it is fortified by a materialist methodology, when the material real lives of people are not kind of pushed away from analysis, then cultural studies, I would say, is one of the richest of domains, in that it becomes almost difficult, and that is why many perhaps would not do cultural studies. It becomes difficult because A, it needs commitment, and B, it needs a self-reflexive attitude in the scholar himself or herself, as he or she from time to time takes stock of his or her own methodology and of doing cultural studies, right. So, now we shall look at some of the questions. For instance, we may have a question like, what are the ways in which cultural studies as a discipline, okay, has been critiqued? Then we would say that it has been seen as a trendy enterprise, as something merely fashionable, not having much scholarly value, and somewhere where a domain where no real research is done, and not a discipline proper. And we saw towards the end that it is not exactly a true or a very good picture of cultural studies, because cultural studies has always had a legacy of political economy, of Marxism, of the materialist approach. Okay. It is only when it becomes too textual, as we did admit, and comes away from its commitment, okay, of helping cultural policy, of showing the underlying mode of production because of which such meanings come about, such texts come about, only then it runs the risk of becoming a shallow enterprise. Next, we also found that uncertainty, provisionality, discourse, indeterminacy and overdetermination, these are some of the things that are not with which many are not happy, but then as we found in the end of towards the end of our lecture, that these are qualities that we have to hold on to. Okay. Otherwise, what happens is the reigning knowledge forms become ideological, and they sort of become naturalized, right. So, it is very important to have a degree of provisionality in our querying of knowledge. Then cultural studies is also sometimes called populist, in the sense that, again going with the trendy and fashionable labels. Okay, populist in the sense that it gives rise to an ideology where if you the reader or the audience is all paramount, the audience can create as many meanings as you saw in the lectures on media, etc. Then audience resistance creates a consumer sovereignty. Okay, therein again there is a problem of giving too much power to the reader, the consumer and the audience. Then through post-structuralist theory, it is also seen as a mere language game. It is seen as too semiotic, where there are there is too much play of meanings, and it is seen as many as too speculative an enterprise. Then name the related domains that have been critical of cultural studies, and this I think is easy for you to remember. The related domains, some of these, at least the most important of these, are anthropology, sociology, literary theory, political economy, particularly Marxism. These are surprisingly kindred domains, and these are the domains whose sort of boundaries have been most threatened by cultural studies. Okay. So, we also saw through Cary Nelson finally that if you look at literary studies in particular, okay, what cultural studies has done is force literary studies to take a new to relook at issues like cultural memory, the canon, okay, the masterworks, and have cultural studies has sort of impelled many to look at their own work and the work of the masters as simply discursive formations, ways of speaking in certain times and certain places, right. And I would like to end on this positive note. Again, as I said, there are, you will be surprised, and if I can talk and also say this for myself, okay, there are many from literary studies that have moved into cultural studies, and some of us who have done so have not, of course, given up literature. But when we adopt and we recognize the importance of cultural studies methodologies, essentially I think what we are doing is understanding that all works are but discursive formations, all works may be objectively looked at and analyzed by cultural studies without turning these works into as far as literature is concerned, without turning these works into fetishes, okay, without turning them into commodities. That, remember, we look at commodity fetishism through Marx in one of the lectures in this module. Okay, the text then literary text becomes, the masterwork becomes a fetish, and where increasingly if it remains a fetish, you would not want to really look at it as a discursive formation. So, there are some bold steps to be taken. At the same time, we are also to look or listen very carefully at the critical voices that are coming on from other areas, and the critique, that is the the uncovering of the foundational assumptions of cultural studies. All these must go on even as we move on with cultural studies. Thank you so much.